Hey TechKnowStuds! Many of you have probably heard the term database before, and maybe even have some concept to what a database is. I feel like it's one of those terms though that we throw around, oh yeah, it's a database server, but not always understand fully what a database is. So in this lesson, we're going to cover the basics of what a database server is. One thing I'm going to do is compare and contrast a database server to what a file server is. A file server is when we want to set up file sharing on a network. We have files and folders that we want to share out to the rest of the network. We set up a machine to be a file server that's going to host those files for other machines on the network. So essentially, we have files and folders that we want to share. So we have a machine that's going to share those out to other machines on the network. A database server is somewhat similar, except for it's not sharing out files and folders. That's not the purpose of it. Instead, a database server holds a bunch of data, and that data then can be shared out to other machines on the network or perhaps servers on the network. We're going to take a look at a couple different setups. So what does a database server do for us? Well, for one, it gives us access to data. So if we're on a machine right here, we would connect to the database server and then access the data of that database server. Another thing that a database server does for us is it helps us interpret the data. That is, we can pull certain reports. We do what's called a query and then pull data and compile data so that way it gives us data in certain formats so we can make conclusions from it. It helps relate different data points. So it can take data from these different areas and put it all together and help display it to us in a certain way. It also provides redundancy, so we can create redundancy with database servers that helps make sure that it has high availability. So if something goes down, one of these servers goes down, that we still have access to that data, and that can be really important. Also, for the data itself, it can provide structure for that data. So we have something called like relational databases, and that relational database will set up a structure so that way we can store the data in some sort of structure. And then it also helps manage all of this data and the services that are happening. For instance, we want to perform backup on our data to make sure that we have it and we don't lose it. And so a database server can help us perform those backups on it and other management tasks for this data. A database server could have many different databases that it's hosting, and those databases could have many different tables, and those tables could have many different records to it. Here's an example of what a table is. As you can see, a table has different columns. We've got employee ID, last name, first name, work phone, and so this is a Google Sheets table. And what we have right here is each row would be considered a record. So a database has multiple tables just like this. And within those tables, it has different records, which would be each row. Essentially, in this case, it'd be an employee per row. So an employee would be a record. One type of database is called a relational database. That means that you have all of these different tables, but there's information within these tables that relate to each other. We use this for things like, let's say, transactions, that you would have a employee, or perhaps maybe it's a customer, and a list of customers that you have in one table with all of the products that they're purchasing on another table that would be grouped up in this table right here for every sale that they do. Now, relational databases can get pretty complex, so this is a very simplistic explanation, but essentially you have lots of tables that are interconnected, that are related to each other. One way we get information into a database and then be able to extract data out of a database is through database commands. That is, we would be on a machine that we would send database commands, and then the database would go and extract that information and give it to us or input the data into its database. One thing that a database does is it allows us to interact with this data through these database commands. One example of that is the structured query language, or SQL. SQL is the commands that we submit to the database server, so that way we can either extract or input data into the system. Let's see an example of how we use database servers. So I'm just going to give you one example. Here we have a client right here, and they want to access a website. So they're going to connect into web services. These are web services, and maybe it's running something like Apache, or maybe it's running some other system here. But essentially what happens a lot of times is we have a database server that's running on these machines that is providing some services and some data to the end client. And then the Apache server is accessing those databases. But a lot of times we also separate out the database so it's its own machine on the back end. So now we have the database servers, we have the web servers, and we have the client. What happens is the client is interacting with the web servers, and then the web servers are accessing then the database. One of the ways that this really helps out with is now these web servers can be redundant. We have 3 web servers right here that are providing web services for this client or for all of the clients, whoever's connecting to it. But they're running all off this same the data on the back end, this database server on the back end. So it doesn't matter really which server you connect to because they're all using the same data to deliver their services. So ultimately, us as users are really used to dealing with files and folders. And if we were to set up sharing on our network, on our home networks, we probably want to share out files and folders. But there is a large number of databases that are out there because a large number of what we have is just data. Data that needs to be structured, data that needs to be managed, data that we need to pull from and be able to put into and compile reports and all sorts of stuff. So there's a large amount of databases that are running out there that help us perform all of these IT functions and all of these services that we're providing to end users.